What is life? Why am I here? How is it all connected? And how am I going to navigate this beautiful but crazy journey? I'm Sylvia and welcome to the Soul Sunshine podcast. Today I'm talking to David Pointon. David is a change process designer and master facilitator. He's a community creator and an earth worker. Over the years, he has found lots of different organizations like Loving Nature, the Men's Table, and The Grove. And right now, he's working on a new project called Earth Chair. He's a nature lover, a mental health advocate, a meditator, a passionate runner, a loving husband, a father to two beautiful children, and just overall a really amazing human. We haven't actually seen each other for a few years now, as I've been busy having babies and doing other things, and David has been busy running his projects, which is why I'm actually super excited to sit here with him today. Welcome to the Soul Sunshine podcast, David. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Sylvia. It's lovely to be having the conversation. Yeah,
I'm looking forward to it. So, David, today we are going to be talking about all things nature. So we're going to be talking about how we're all profoundly connected with nature and how it affects us physically as well as emotionally and mentally. We're also talking about our relationships with nature, our unique ways of being connected to it, why a lot of people have lost their connection to nature over the years, and how we can regain this really beautiful relationship that at the end of the day should really come very natural to us all. David, we met years ago. When did we meet? In 2013 or something like that?
Yeah, I think it was. It was 8 years ago.
Yeah, I think it was in 2013. And so we both worked out of Hub Sydney, which is a co-working space in the city. And we just used to run into each other in the common areas, and we used to just exchange thoughts over cups of teas and have mixed bag lunches together and Friday night drinks, and had lots of conversations along the way. And I just remember you were always one of those people that I was actually really excited to run into when in the common areas. I was always like, oh, there's David. It's always good to have a chat with him.
Oh, thanks. And I remember there was what was the thing where you could do, you get some numbers, and we found our numbers were exactly the same.
Oh yeah, that's my little body trick, is it?
Yeah.
It's the 9 star key, it's called. It's a traditional Chinese way of looking at what your energies in your body are. Right. It's part of Feng Shui, face reading, all that kind of goes into the same category. And 9 star key is one of them, where you get an adult number, a child number, and an energy number. And that's that kind of teaches you how you're coming across and how other people see you, but also, what your passions could be in life, all sorts of different things. And I remember doing it with you. And we had the same number.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's like, how awesome is that?
Yeah, there you go.
That was pretty cool. So David, just to start off the conversation today, tell me why nature is so important to you. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about your story, where you grew up, your backstory, and how this deep connection to nature really came about.
Well, I spent some time in my younger years living in a couple of small country towns in South Australia. And I guess when you live outside of a city, nature is closer by. You sort of got more countryside around. So I've got fond memories of climbing lots of trees and digging a hole that became a cubby house that we put a covering over, and, riding out away from the town into the country, into the bush. I've got a memory of being by the ocean side in South Australia, on the Eyre Peninsula actually, which was a pretty wild coastline, and also memories of going crayfishing with my grandparents and my father, and on the back of the Land Rover, going through the sand dunes into a very wild part of the coast, which is now a national park. And while the men would go out onto the rock shelves and then dive down and get crayfish, we would play up in the sand dunes or fossick in the water holes and so on. So these are all very, visceral kind of embodied memories. And as soon as I start talking about them, I'm like right back in those places. And it was actually something that I might talk about later, but when I talk with others about their relationship with nature, one of the simple ways to get into that is just what are some of those memories that people have. And It's an amazing thing. All of us have got these different kinds of memories, whatever they might be. And I suppose without me knowing it, that was shaping the way I felt about being part of this amazing earth. And then I became an outdoor education teacher, and I kind of stumbled into that during my university years. I followed that track of getting accreditations in lots of adventure activities, rock climbing, whitewater kayaking, sailing, and mountaineering and bushwalking. And then casting forward, I ended up in a corporate work environment doing consulting into corporations and so on. And as we raised our children, we would take them camping at least once a year. And we've got a couple of favourite places that, my kids who are now young adults will still have, very strong and fond memories of. But I suppose it's fair to say I'd sort of started to lose some of that regular contact with wild nature. And then I came across this guy called John P. Milton, a US American kind of elder. The white beard, just a classic kind of eldership energy that he carries. Very humble, quiet man with a lot of deep kind of spirituality, and had been really investigating, the opportunity to commune and relate with nature in a profoundly different way. And his basic process was like a rite of passage, like a vision quest from the indigenous times, essentially taking some time to go into the bush alone, starting as a group to orient and become aware and open to, what might be possible in the way we relate with wild nature. Then taking some time alone, and the original program I did with John was 6 days on my own in the bush. And there was other people around, so you were not like cast out on your own, but they were out of eyeshot, out of earshot. They were, somewhere else. And then coming back together at the end of that time, back into the group and kind of debriefing and reflecting and sharing what was the experience. And what happened there was a really pivotal moment. I actually arrived at my site. We'd sort of located these sites, and I ended up choosing this place at the end of an estuary right to the coast in Tasmania on Flinders Island. And I arrived at my site and I put my pack down, and I was overcome with emotion and just kind of burst into tears. And what it was about was I'd had all of this familiarity with camping and the outdoors, but I realised in that moment, as I was kind of entering into the threshold of 6 days alone on my own, that I was actually quite disconnected, that I had what I now understand was a transactional way of relating with earth and with nature. And I didn't really have a relationship more that was based in the heart and in my body. It was me getting what I wanted from nature rather than me being a part of nature. And I wasn't aware of that at the time. I just hit this point of upset because I could feel that block or that kind of superficiality. And then during the course of that 6 days, I had many profound moments of just dropping further into a way of what John would describe as communing with nature. And that really set me on a new course where I became aware and more open to the profound opportunity that we all have to kind of nourish our relationship with nature.
That's really interesting, because the first thing that comes to mind when you're talking about memories around nature, I grew up in the Austrian country in a big house with a big garden next to a huge forest. And I remember me and my brother just running off into the forest after school, and my parents wouldn't see us until dinner. And yeah, they're just such beautiful memories. And it's like you said, when you go back there, you're just there, you can really draw on that. But what really interested me in what you said now, so you spent 6 days alone in the bush by yourself, and you're talking about the transactional way versus the relationship that comes from the heart. And I would like to dive a bit deeper into that, because when you're talking about, you're going camping, but then suddenly you're there by yourself in the middle of the bush. And I guess it comes back to, we go camping and we think we connect with nature, but at the same time, you're quite busy. You've got your kids running around, you've got your tent to pitch, you've got to think about dinner, all those other things going on. Well, yeah, if you're somewhere by yourself in the middle of the bush and it's just you and nobody else, and that's going to be the way for the next 6 days, I imagine that's a whole different experience. So I'd really like you to talk to that difference a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, the idea, and you started off with it, that, we're disconnected from nature. At one level, you could say we are in our modern world. At another level, I've come to recognise we never are. At a very physiological level, we're always connected to nature. We're breathing air and we're eating and being nourished by food that comes directly from earth in whatever way, even if we've, industrialised our farming. That food and that nourishment is still coming from earth. And we exist in the greater context and ecosystem of earth, like earth sustains us in every possible way. So we actually aren't disconnected. I think what happens in the way I've come to understand it is we forget our connection. We're less aware and we're paying less attention to that connection. So I think what happened for me during that time in Flinders Island and through the support with John and his program was starting to pay attention that, relationships, I guess, of all kinds, including the ones we have with other people, have got so many layers to them. And at one level, it can be this sort of quite superficial, transactional, getting what we need. Or in a business meeting, Ben and I were just talking earlier about a meeting that typically starts in an organisation where it begins about work and the tasks to be done, rather than just relating with each other as humans, like, how are you? What's happening in your life, even if it's only a couple of minutes, and checking in at that human level. So there's these different levels that we have in all of our relationships, and I think with our relationship with Earth and with nature, we mostly exist at that more superficial level because we're not paying as much attention to these other potential layers. And I suppose slowing down is one simple thing that I learned and started to realise, and just slowing down, becoming more present, opening our senses is another thing. So after I knew we would be having this chat, I was just thinking about, okay, so I had a day yesterday where I just, I was busy in the morning in front of my laptop. I got in the car, we drove up to the Blue Mountains, we had a meeting with somebody, we went and had another meeting with somebody, we drove home. And so I was thinking, okay, so where was my attention to nature in that time? And I remembered there was a moment we got out of the car after driving an hour and a half, and it was just in the car park. There was a fine mist, and I just remember I just relished in that moment of feeling that mist on my face and on my arms. And there was a coolness in the air, and there was just an ever so slight breeze. And it was allowing the senses to be open at that point to that was what was happening. And here I was in the middle of a town, so it wasn't like wild nature. But see, I'm still in nature because my understanding now of nature is that it's all of our earth, it's all of life around us. So in that moment, I was able to just open my senses and allow that presence of mind, presence of body, if we like, to be there in the communion with something bigger than ourselves, with the wider environment. So I think that's probably what I was learning and starting to practice back then at Flinders Island, and where I realised that we can drop into deeper levels. And the way I think about these levels now, or maybe the practice of how do we access or open ourselves, is I think the first thing is the remembering. And I think of that not just cognitively, like let's remember our connection with nature, but if we look at when we are dismembered, we're kind of cut off. Like if we're dismembered, something's chopped away from us. If we remember, we're rejoined. And so there's a remembering that I think is involved by just noticing and knowing that, yeah, we are part of this. We're part of Earth. It's undeniable. That's the remembering. Then there's the nourishing. And I think it's like opening the senses, allowing ourselves to receive the abundance of nature, because nature's always giving to us. There's no conditions attached. There's no contract we have to sign. Nature and Earth just keep giving to us abundantly and forever. And there's a nourishing by allowing ourselves to receive, but then also to kind of give back. There's a nourishment in the giving back. How do I have gratitude for Earth and for all of what nature gives me? For example, sitting to a meal, how do we just pause and appreciate, where has this food come from? It's come from the earth. And then the third stage to me is the embodying, so that these practices allow us to sort of take nature, if you like, into our bones, to realize that we are always profoundly connected, to know that in our bodies. And I feel that the embodied sense of connection then allows us to be in relationship both from our heart, but also through our senses, through our bodies, through a whole person experience of being in nature. So not sure if that answers the question, but that's where I was
No, I really like
going.
that, because you're putting a little bit of a different spin on it, because you're saying people are not necessarily not connected to nature. You can connect to nature at every given point. And I think that's a really important message, because a lot of the time you think, well, I live in the city, and you come up with other excuses why you feel like you're not connected to nature. But it's really, like you said, about slowing down and appreciating and just noticing the little things. And I just think about my children when I hear that as well, because I feel like young kids really help you do that as well. They stop at every stone and they turn over every rock and take a leaf here and the flower there, and they're really appreciating all the little things that are around them, which as an adult you kind of forget about. You're just hustling in your life and you're just going from A to B without really thinking what you see on the way, kind of thing.
Yes, absolutely. And I think being present, there's a lot of talk about it in schools of mindfulness and meditation and all the rest of it. But really one simple way to be mindful and to be present is through our senses. And, you have a look, we're walking down the street. If we've got young children or dogs, they're often like a gravitational force that brings people together. And we all start as adults who may not have said hello to each other on the street, but now we're all in that moment together. The dog or the child has brought us into that moment. So like you say, there's a beautiful presence about young people, young children, young animals, all animals, to bring us back. And it's both a mindfulness. I think about the idea of mindfulness, not just as in the head, in the brain, but also in the body. That mindfulness is about reconnecting with what's happening right in this moment in our bodies as well, at the feelings, the sensations, the senses. Just coming here this morning and knowing the name of your podcast, my wife plays all sorts of music, and just as I was leaving the house, a very old ballad by John Denver called Sunshine was playing. It's a beautiful song, and sunshine on my shoulder makes me happy, and he's just talking about this moment of feeling the sun and just being there present.
That's beautiful. That was like a sign that you were supposed to do the podcast today. So where did your journey lead you after this? You said that was a very eye-opening experience for you and a very transformational experience. Where did you go from there?
Well, I kind of realized that, with the work I'd done and just my experiences with Earth, and also I'd been a facilitator in my professional life, I just kind of thought, my work is to really share this awareness and these practices and these ways of opening to Earth and to nature with others, as well as continuing to nourish that for myself. So soon after we came back from Flinders Island, there'd been a group of us, and there was a number of people that I knew reasonably well. And we said to John, how about we start a similar kind of practice here, kind of drawing on your wisdom and practices. He'd written a book called Sky Above, Earth Below, and they've got some really simple but important practical things you can do to allow for these greater openings. We said, can we maybe do this in Australia here? Because he'd travelled from the US. So we started a group and began to run shorter retreats. We'd do 4-day program, 1 day arriving as a group and preparing, if you like, opening, stepping into a alone time for 2 days, and then coming back together for the 4th day and into a group setting again. And we found that you didn't need 6 days. You could also see incredible things happening for people even in a shorter time. And I suppose I was also doing those programs myself, also entering back into this alone time. It started to have me really appreciate more the power, the benefits of all of this nourishment of connection with nature. And so then I became really curious about what is our relationship with nature? How do people see it? And particularly those who aren't coming to a retreat like this, because they're already going, I think I want more of that. What about the average person on the street? And I started an interview project, and I called it Loving Nature, because it was kind of seen both as an adjective, that nature is kind of loving in a way, but then it's also a verb. How do we love nature? So Loving Nature was there, and I just started to talk with people, and I recorded these interviews, and they were in 2 parts. I just asked people, what's your relationship with nature? And then I asked them, how do they see humanity's relationship with nature? And it was really wonderful to hear people sharing about this. And by the end of the conversation, they would invariably say, this conversation alone has just further deepened my appreciation or reawakened my awareness of how connected I am or how much I want to be connected with nature.
What were some of the most revealing points that were coming out of that?
I suppose one thing is, as I've already said at the start, one of the questions early on was about what's just one moment that you can remember where you had a profound experience of connecting and relating with nature. And everyone had something. And it might have been the simplest of moments that they would just recall, or it might have been some quite profound experience that they had. And I would invariably have goosebumps, listening to these stories. I'd be right there with them in that moment with all of those feelings. And that was amazing just to see how accessible it is, because this relationship is stored in our bodies, from our childhood, as well as our minds. I think the other thing, I did 75 interviews. It just sort of flowed along. I didn't really have much of a plan. I looked then at what I'd got and I mapped the data, and I saw kind of 2 main things. What I realised is we all have a way of relating with nature, which is essentially a loving relationship with nature, but it's expressed and felt and experienced in our own unique ways. That was the first thing. We all have our own relationship with nature. And the second is, but we don't live collectively as if we do. We've kind of designed and created a society and a lifestyle that has created barriers and separation from that profound sense of connection that we all have access to. And most people would have some sort of lamenting of that, feeling sad or feeling stuck or feeling, wow, we've really got ourselves backed into a corner here because of the way we've now designed our lives and our society. So that was there as well. My metaphor for it was, if we imagine Earth for a moment as our mother, all of us, most of us would have some sort of a loving sense of connection with our mothers. Of course, some people don't because of, difficulties they would have had. But let's just say we've got a loving relationship with mum, but maybe we take her for granted. Maybe if she's still alive, we don't phone her as much as we could. She's in the background there, but we carry on with our life and get busy and neglect that relationship. That was kind of like a metaphor I had, and I felt that was a similar thing to what people were saying, was they recognised this loving relationship with nature and with Earth, but often weren't attending to that in a really active and nourishing way.
It's really interesting as well how you talk about the difference between your own connection to nature and then the collective connection to nature. And even this day and age when we're talking about climate change and all those things as well, it's like how we're feeling towards it personally, but then what's being done in the big collective in order to really, nourish that and, make sure that that's still there for all of us.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
Yeah, I started to become interested in the underlying kind of narratives of our societies. And Joseph Campbell talked about the myths that we live by. Each group of people, humans over the course of time, had myths, have had the deep sort of spiritual stories about what is life all about. And, for most of the course of human history, those narratives were deeply woven into being part of Earth and having stewardship of Earth and recognising the important responsibility that we had to sustaining and nourishing the earth and the country and the land. And now we've got these narratives of growth, this idea of perpetual growth. We've got a narrative of separation. The modern economic story and the marketing story is you just get what you want. You as an individual are important. You go after what you want. And so the idea of separation, and we could strip back and look at, where did this come from? The idea that Descartes had of I think, therefore I am. Some suggest that Cartesian split is a time that was pivotal in human development, particularly in the West, where we started to separate ourselves from the wider context and started to cultivate this sense of individualization rather than seeing the broader system that we're a part of. I became interested in this and, what were the roots of it? Even the origins of the Old Testament, the idea that we came out of the Garden of Eden, we ate from the tree of knowledge and then became sinful. I sort of, in my mind, said, well, was that us emerging into consciousness, into an awareness that we have awareness, and that then beginning the sense of, or the potential for separation from nature? Because if we look at animals, we've already talked about this presence they have, this moment-by-moment existence they have as a part of nature and Earth. That might be a distinct feature between us and the other animals, is that we've got this mind that then analyses and objectifies and separates, or can do. It doesn't have to, but it can do. So I think, the way we've chosen to adopt these stories collectively and I suppose unconsciously, and we're all part of those stories of growth, of separation, have led to, the way we're now living, where Earth has been under our dominion. We've got to just use it as a resource. And this is the transactional thing, there's a forest over there, let's just use that. Somebody just told me recently, why is Amazon, the company, worth billions, but Amazon, the forest, is worth nothing until it's chopped down and put onto logging trucks? Like, how can that be? That's crazy. But if we look at those underlying narratives, you can see how it follows from the deep-rooted belief systems we might be operating from.
That was so interesting what you just said, because you touched on so many things there, and I really love it because it really shows how egoistical to a degree we are all living. And it's like over the last decades, it just became more and more about, like you said, what you are having and what you can achieve. But it's a very Western, modern world phenomenon as well. I think in other parts of the world, there's still a lot more of community and of that feeling going on because they just simply need it in order to survive, right? We are living in such a privileged privileged society where it's almost like it's my way or the highway, you know, because I don't really need you. And it's interesting talking to you now as well, just after we've had almost a year of COVID, a global pandemic hitting the world, and something that suddenly doesn't just affect the third world and the developing countries, but something that's very deeply affecting the Western society as well, and how people suddenly freak out about that because, you know, it's suddenly something that's in front of your doorstep and that you can't just push away and see in the news and don't think about it anymore. So I guess I'm also interested to talk to you about how you think something like the global pandemic is potentially changing that view again, because people suddenly are realizing that things can hit them as well, and then how that changes the way that they behave in their environment, within their communities, and how that affects them on a very deep level.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing, this COVID. And one of the things that I've really come to appreciate the more I've reoriented and opened more to the way I relate with Earth and with nature is also understanding at a mental level that it's a complex living system. Earth is just this incredible interwoven web of life, of relationships, of interactions, of energy exchanges. And we can't possibly just put that in a little scientific box or describe it all. It's got so many unknown properties and qualities. And in fact, you know, science is very limited in a way because science drills down deeply into one little vertical channel of anything rather than going, well, how do we understand those system interactions, system dynamics? And a couple of the things that I've come to understand about system dynamics and therefore, you know, the Earth that we're living on is there are these emergent qualities of complex systems that can't be predicted. So, you know, there's a whole range of things going on that the science models can't show, and the sociologists and the people who are trying to map, okay, so how will people behave now? Because it's a complex system. You know, even you mentioned climate change. I heard just yesterday, you know, Texas apparently just had this crazy minus 20 Fahrenheit or something, you know, down in the desert. Now it's winter, but, you know, did any of the models show that that was going to happen on that particular day? No, probably not. So then I think about COVID. Well, the actual arising of COVID is also an emergent quality of this changing system dynamic that we're all part of. No one had COVID and a pandemic in their risk management plans in organisations. You know, most of the world weren't paying attention to preparing for something like this. So then the other quality that I understand about system dynamics that I find quite optimistic, if you like, is this idea of bifurcation, which is that a system can make a fairly sudden and dramatic leap to a higher order of complexity and functioning. You think about, you know, the evolution of cells and life. It began in such a simple way with single-celled and multi-cell organisms, but at some point the organisms somehow got together and said, well, let's become an organ and then let's become a larger entity. And these leaps of complexity to higher orders is a quality that we can see that's happened and it is happening in Earth. So I also think about maybe we're in the midst of some sort of bifurcation, you know, as a human society and also as a part of our relationship with Earth. That, you know, I mean, it could be that we're in major system collapse, but that's also a part of the feature of the dynamics of systems is there's growth stages and there's decline stages and there's collapse and death stages and then there's new birth stages and new growth stages. So are we sort of in the midst of both a collapsing system but at the same time some sort of a bifurcation? And who knows? I'm curious about it, and I'll make the link back to the topic for today, and that is that because of the way I've been just orienting to and understanding more about this incredible complex life system that we are part of called Earth, you know, I have a greater appreciation that we won't know. But what we can do is perhaps try to live more in harmony with those underlying life principles, the underlying patterns of how Earth actually has existed and sustained itself for so long. So, you know, maybe the fact that we're perhaps living out of kilter with some of those underlying principles, such as the basic idea of regeneration, where, you know, things need to be recycled back into life-giving systems in order to sustain life. We can't just keep depleting and taking from life, because that will deplete and ultimately lead to the decline of the health of that system. If we had greater regenerative ways of living, we would surely be giving ourselves greater opportunities to continue to be part of this amazing life experiment that's going on all around us.
Yeah, which is, I think, also an area where there's a lot of work happening at the moment. So hopefully we'll see some good outcomes from that.
And I think the positive thing is there's more and more people really starting to pay attention to these ways that we could be choosing to live differently. And I guess it starts at an individual level, but conversations like we're having are part of that. So it's also in the conversations and in the way we relate with each other. And then, of course, it's in the way we design and make decisions about the bigger systems as well.
So you're working on a new project at the moment. Tell me about that. It's called Earth Chair.
So Earth Chair came to me. There's an author called Elizabeth Gilbert who has written a few books. Eat, Pray, Love is one, but she also wrote a book called Big Magic, and it's about the creative process. And she talks about that, inspiration or visions come along to people, and they either choose to partner with that vision or inspiration, or they don't. And if they don't, that thing will move along to somebody else. It'll be seeking a partner. If we choose it, it's kind of like, okay, I choose to work with you, this vision, this inspiration, and partner with you in making something happen. That's very much what it felt like when I had this thing come to me called Earth Chair. And it came to me with the idea of a chair for Earth in every boardroom. And I also instantly saw it as a simple practice. And the idea is that in a boardroom or in any meeting or any conversation, maybe at any family dinner table, we could have literally an empty chair, which is kind of set for Earth, to bring Earth in as a stakeholder, as another player in our dynamic in that conversation at that family dinner table. And whilst we interact as humans and take turns and hear from each other, we could also give Earth a turn and stop and listen. So I put this into one of the communities that I'm a part of called The Grove and said, hey, how about we try this? So we've been in the practice of that off and on over the past couple of years, and we'll be having a conversation. We'll set up literally an empty chair for Earth. Sometimes we'll put some sort of natural artifact there, a bit of bark or some leaves or something, just to kind of, bring the symbol of Earth in. And then as we go around the circle or hear from each person, we'll at some point allow time for Earth. And it's literally saying, okay, well, why don't we give Earth a couple of minutes and we'll just pause, and it's a listening practice, and we just stop and we listen for Earth. Now, it's not like Earth is speaking to us in language, maybe. For me, it's more of a feeling and a sensing experience I have when we stop and really listen. Other people say they do hear almost like a voice or some sort of a heartbeat, or, various things might emerge. And it's not like we're listening for a particular thing. But what happens is it just really shifts the context for that particular time with those people. It opens us out to, yeah, right, we're here in a bigger system. There's another stakeholder always present. And the thing is, we're out of the practice of listening to Earth, to her. And so what happens is, okay, the timer goes off and then we just move on. But it's somehow recalibrated, or it's opened, or it's expanded the context of the conversation or of the time that we spent together. And there are times where we might also say, well, do people want to share anything that they heard or experienced? And even just hearing a few voices, it can be incredibly powerful to allow for that. It definitely adds something of a rich layer to the context, to the meeting, to the discussion. So now I'm working with another co-founder, another steward of this thing. And the idea is just to make this a really simple suggested practice to people at any time. And I guess like any practice, maybe we get better with it over time. And then the longer term vision of it is that as we go forward, perhaps we start to be able to recognise Earth is a genuine stakeholder that should always be in every decision that we make as well. And ultimately, perhaps enshrined in law, that organisations and decision making must have a representation of kind of Earth, if you like, of the voice of Earth there, so that when we're facing decisions that ultimately lead to destruction and to ways of living that are detrimental to the health of our planet, maybe we'll rethink that. Maybe we'll have a different context to consider from. So who knows how far it'll go. We're at the early stages, but one thing we know is it's a very simple practice. Anyone can do it at any time, and it seems that within the space of a couple of minutes, it actually really has some profound addition to the conversation and to the humans that are gathered.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It reminds me of that model of people, planet, prosperity that you're looking at, and always making sure that whatever you do has a positive impact on all of those.
Yeah, that's right. There's a range of things like this that I think are starting to come in, and the idea of Earth being enshrined in law. There's a couple of case studies around the world. A river in New Zealand has been given kind of legal status that it exists as an entity, therefore it has rights. And that's kind of a signpost, I think, of where we will ultimately need to go to build greater governance and stewardship into our law as well.
So we've talked a lot about how important nature is and how important the connection to nature is. Where I would like to take you next is, why do you think a healthy connection to nature is really important for mental health and well-being as well? I know you've got other ventures that you're working on that are in that space as well, and it's all really connected. So I would like to explore with you a little bit the side of that. Why is nature so important for our well-being?
I started looking at the research in the Loving Nature project when I was doing the interviews. I was sort of thinking maybe there's a book here or something like that. And there's a range of research that just points to what seems to be pretty common sense, which is if we allow ourselves to be more nourished and in communion with nature, we're going to benefit. So studies of children in different schooling environments, some where there's more greenery around the play yards and some where it's more walled in by city blocks and so on, and just their general health and well-being. A simple study in a hospital where the healing and recovery time of patients when they're exposed, even with a view to some green outside the window compared to those who don't have that, the healing times are better. So there's all these kind of little micro examples of where we would generally say would be common sense. Yes, if we are indeed a part of this earth and we are actually connected to the life that's been given to us by this earth, then of course, paying attention to that and the way we actually nourish ourselves with that is going to have health benefits. So, that's about as far as I can recall, exactly what does the research say. And if I was a bit more in the practice of this, maybe I'd be able to pull more of the science data down to sort of validate that, because in our modern world, we seem to like to have the scientific evidence to make something credible.
A lot of people do, yeah. I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going more from a gut feel and from a universal point, I think. But yeah, a lot of people just really want to see the stats.
See the stats, that's right. And it helps to validate things in terms of, funding and making decisions at senior levels and this sort of thing if you've got the science. But I'm like you, I think I just sort of settle into my own lived experience. And, there are times where, this morning, so I'm going for a morning walk and I've got to walk out of my house down sort of a semi-busy road and then for about 200 metres along quite a busy road. And then I just veer into a patch of bush that runs along a side of a little creek and has been, maintained fairly much as a little pocket of wild nature in amidst the city. And I was oblivious to much at all. I was just walking along and then I veered into the creek side and the bush, and within 50 metres I suddenly came to my senses and I realised that walking down the side of the busy road, my mind was kind of active, not frenzied, but a bit activated, and the rushing of the cars and the hardness of the asphalt and the bitumen road and all of those things now sat in contrast to my immediate experience, which was suddenly the smell of the moisture coming, because there'd been some rain last night, the moisture coming from these trees, and so that beautiful fresh vegetation smell of wet soil, wet leaves was there. There was a coolness because there was already a bit of sun and that was shaded by the trees. And then the softness on my eyes, suddenly I've gone from just black and hard cars and rushing cars to the softness of the vision. And of course, suddenly I just feel differently, like there's an almost instantaneous shift that's taking place there. So to me, it's incontrovertible that, of course, that's healthy for us, and that if we only have a diet and an experience and a lifestyle that has us in that metaphorical fast lane with the cars rushing and the city going by, and we don't allow ourselves time to soften and to slow down and to receive those beautiful gifts from the natural world, then, it surely isn't great for our bodies, our minds, our soul. So, we can all surely have experiences of relating to how a moment or an afternoon spent with some natural environment is no doubt beneficial to us. And there's certainly some books, The Last Child in the Woods, written by Richard Louv, talked to nature deficit disorder for children. And he did all the research on the science. And he sort of said, wow, we've got this generation of kids growing up that don't have immediate access to natural places because they're cityfied and they're struggling. They've got record levels of anxiety and depression. They've got learning difficulties. They've got all these things going on. And he's correlated that to the absence of time in nature and access to nature.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, like I said, I have two little kids, and for me, growing up in the Austrian country and now them growing up in the city, like sometimes I do feel a little bit guilty and a little bit bad that they're not living in the most natural environment. But I mean, we live close to the beach, so there is natural environment. It's just different, you know. But I've always done it with my kids. When we go to the parks, I always make them hug the trees, and I hug the trees with them, and I touch the bark with their little hands. I really try and pick out the pockets in the city where I can go. And I mean, city is a great city when it comes to that, you know, because you do have lots of little pockets of bushland. And I really try and go there and consciously spend time there with them so that they get away from that hustle that they see a lot of the times when we're just driving somewhere, you know. I find that really important because, yeah, I grew up like that. And I feel like when you grow up yourself like that and when it's important for you, it's something that you want to also instill in your children as much as you can.
And I think, you know, yes, you might be living in a busy city and maybe feeling guilty, but I think it doesn't take that much immersion. And we don't have to be in wild nature, you know, which is untrammeled by humans. There's a tree straight out the window here that I've been just glancing at as we talk, and it stands in contrast to the buildings around it. And even just that ability to see that tree right now is having some sort of, I believe, benefit on me, on my health, on my being, because it's there, it's breathing, it's doing its thing. I personally have a particular fondness of trees. Trees for me are a real connection point. One of my favourite things to do if I just feel like I need to recharge or nourish, just lay on my back on the ground at the base of a tree. And, you know, 5 minutes of that, and there's some kind of a recharge that I feel in myself. And, you know, the tree is another credible living organism that's also complex. And, you know, there's all sorts of research showing how trees are so alive and communicate with other trees through their roots and actually exchange nutrients in a forest setting to move nutrients to the tree that's ill or struggling, so that the trees are working together to sustain each other. And then, you know, laying on the ground under a tree, you've got the canopy of the tree above you, but you've also got the roots coming down under the ground beneath you. So you're actually kind of held, if you like, in a kind of like an embrace of its arms, you know, like the branches and the roots encapsulating us on the ground. So, you know, that's just one thing that I think is possible for us. Of course, there are many things, like sitting on the beach, just looking out to the ocean, even for 5 minutes. You know, these all have therapeutic benefits. So I think, you know, we mustn't beat ourselves up that we live in the city and we can't give our kids access all the time to nature, because it doesn't take that much.
Yeah, that's true. There's a few things I want to talk to now, because what you just said with lying under the tree and just looking up, it's so funny that you say that, because I do exactly the same thing. I love it. Like for me, it's like you said, it gives me so much energy. It feels like you're being energized by the living organism that's surrounding you. So I do exactly the same. Yeah, my husband's always like, you have to stop at every tree. And there's a little fun fact, but you know, my maiden name is Baumgartner, right? And Baumgartner, it's a German name. And if you translate it, it's called tree gardener. So for me, wonderful. I've always loved trees, and I'm always like, well, I've kind of been given it by birth, right? Because I've had the name my whole life, but I'm the same. I just find trees are such a wonderful and powerful thing that we do have around. And yeah, my kids are the same. They love trees. Max, my older one, I remember being at the playground with him and all the kids playing on the equipment, and I'm looking around, I'm like, where did he go? Like, I totally lost him. I'm like, shit, where did Max go? And then this guy comes up to me, he's like, are you looking for him? And I'm looking up, and he's just up a tree on the side of the playground, and I'm like, awesome, that's my child. I love it.
Great.
Yeah, they just love it. And so it's like you said, yeah, you do find those pockets. But so you were talking about that we're not necessarily disconnected to nature, because we are always connected and we can always make sure we are connecting back into that. But do you feel people are conscious of that, or do you feel like people are disconnected from nature these days because they might not realize how simple it could potentially be to connect back into that energy?
I think there is a lot of distraction and busyness that does lead to that sort of experience of being disconnected and not even noticing, like you say. I mean, just having a look on a train platform, virtually everyone standing there has got their face in their smartphone, whereas actually there's sky above and there's going to be a tree somewhere. So, these micro moment opportunities are available to all of us to put our attention away from the digital world, from our busyness, from our schedule, and have, even just a few moments of allowing ourselves to pause, like I said at the start, open our senses, slow down, and kind of relax. And just even paying attention to our breath as we do that, and releasing, breathing out, relaxing. Those three things, that was John Milton's teaching as well. He's got these sort of steps or principles that he goes through in his book, Sky Above, Earth Below. And slow down, become present, open your senses. They were the gateways into this way of communing. And these can be done literally in moments. So, the sky is another always accessible part of our way of relating. There's always something happening in the sky, clouds or, some sort of a change. Or if it's a perfectly clear blue sky day, there's the sunshine and the warmth of the sunshine. There's the air we just take for granted, and it's always there, always giving to us. So I think there's an opportunity for us to instill some practice into our lives of just taking these moments and putting our phones down, taking a moment between, so many people now in the COVID world, it's back-to-back Zoom meetings. So, closing the one Zoom meeting, getting up from the desk, walking, even if it's just to a window, and taking a minute just to stand by the window and look out and just, again, slowing down, relaxing, opening our senses, let alone, getting a cup of tea and sitting out on our deck, or going out and sitting on the lawn if we've got some, or these sorts of things, again, for these few minutes. So I think these are all things that we can do, and that I suppose many of us are not in the practice of. And I think one thing I noticed in my interviews in Loving Nature was that I actually deliberately asked about 20 minutes into the conversation, oh, and by the way, we've been talking about nature. How do you define nature? And I found that there's a really interesting continuum that people locate where they put nature on. For some people, nature is only a wild place that's never been touched by humans somewhere over there. It's certainly not here, it's away out over there somewhere. Other people have got nature as anywhere where there's a decent patch of bush or a decent patch of forest. For others, it's something that just is alive, so it doesn't include concrete buildings. And then for others, it's right down the other end of a spectrum, which is it's the entire cosmos, and it's certainly all of Earth, including all of our concrete buildings and all of our human-made artefacts. And I think that's an interesting thing because, where we locate nature maybe makes it either more or less accessible. If we've got nature as only in the wild places, and here we are in a city in front of Zoom, it's like, well, I just can't get access to nature. But if we start to think about nature in a more expansive and sort of holistic way, then we say, well, actually, it is always there. It is always available to us. We just have to pay attention.
You just have to be conscious about it, right? It's just what you said before as well. You went from your house and you walked down the busy road. And even though you were then already walking through the bushland, it took you a minute to realize how your environment has changed. So it's really about starting to be more conscious where you are at and what's around you.
Yeah.
And it's like you said, it's so simple because you can look at the tree or lie on the tree. You can look out over the ocean. I always think walking barefoot down the beach or in the bush or anywhere is always really good as well. It really connects you into the earth as well. So there's a lot of simple things that people can do.
Yeah, and interestingly, during COVID, so many more people have become pet owners and dog owners. And sure, there's companionship needs that are probably being met where people are on their own at home and not having the human interaction. But as we've already talked about, animals are a part of this living earth and are also a way of bringing us into the moment. One of the interesting things as well I find is that this idea that different species can have an affectionate relationship. There's memes that go on where you get the duck on the back of the horse. And so we've got a new puppy and
I know, I've seen it.
Yeah,
it's so cute.
He's very cute.
Oh my God.
And we've got a 9-year-old cat who grew up with our past dog who died a couple of years ago. So the cat knows dogs and knows that dogs can be cool, right? But here comes this bouncing, rambunctious puppy who's just trying to jump all over the cat. And little by little, the cat is just letting him come in. He's giving him the occasional swipe across the nose going, hang on a minute, mate, that's a bit too rough. But it's a joy to watch these different species coming into a relationship with each other. That's another part of our intrinsic humanity, is a recognition of how beautiful it is to see the interaction between species, between living things.
I love it. The cat's like, this is my house. I've been by myself for a few years. What are you doing here?
Yeah.
And slowly she's like, okay, you can be my friend again.
Exactly. That's exactly the body language is, yeah, okay, I'm ready to let you in, you know?
Yeah. Oh, that's so cute. What I find really interesting as well when it comes to nature and our connection to nature, you know, how we relate to nature. We're living in Australia. So looking at Aboriginal history, Aboriginal people are the oldest living culture in the world. And there's such a deep sense of connection to the country and connection to Earth, where I feel like there's so much that we could learn there as well. You know, there's so much that those people could teach us. Have you had any experiences with Aboriginal culture and how they connect to nature, and how does that potentially influence your work as well?
I was fortunate. I went into the centre of Australia and spent 4 days on what was called a cultural exchange experience, and we hung out with the Indigenous people there. And the idea was they would just, you know, kind of invite us into their way of living and teach us a bit of their law in the centre of Australia. It's called their Jukapa. And, you know, like if I was to sort of summarise what I saw and what I heard there was sort of a threefold love and respect. Love and respect for self, love and respect for each other, and love and respect for country. And country being kind of earth, being the whole, you know, whole of life. Country including the animals as well. And that was just so holistic and so simple. And then so much, you know, flowed from that. But I don't think I'm equipped and the person to make too much comment about the Indigenous wisdom, because I'm just so much at the beginning of learning about that. I'm reading Tyson Yunkaporta's book, Sand Talk, at the moment, which is a beautiful insight. And the way he's playfully written that and exposing us Westerners to some of the different worldviews and paradigms and ways of seeing things is really refreshing. So I suppose at the moment I sort of feel like I'm really, you know, at the beginning stages of a journey. But I have a sense that there's such incredible value and depth of what we can learn, and its value to us. I mean, just something really practical, like the way we deal with fire in this country. You know, the Indigenous people knew how to burn the country to ensure its health, and we don't. And then we have these raging bushfires. And so surely if we learned about what they know and what they did, that would be incredibly valuable. And then I was at a talk with an Indigenous elder, and he'd talked about totems just a little bit. And I asked a question. I said, so I'm really curious about totems. What was the sort of spiritual significance of having a totem? And he sort of responded to that, but he said, look, don't dismiss that there was also a very practical benefit and reason for having totems. If your totem was the goanna, he said, part of your job was to ensure that everyone else didn't eat all of the goannas. You know, so there was just like a really inbuilt sustainability function there as well. So these are just a couple of examples of where I think the value of their knowledge is so profound and important to us. I believe we're in some kind of a shift taking place in Australia where more of us are starting to pay attention and valuing what we have previously discarded and ignored. So I hope that we can continue to open ourselves, and more people can open themselves to the learning and the wisdom. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'm with you. I really hope that that shift will happen, because it just feels like there's so much knowledge and so much wisdom there that could be shared with not just Australians but with the world. There's one more experience that I want to go into. I know you have spent some time in India for a while. I think that happened since we've last seen each other, actually. So I'm really interested in diving a little bit into that experience. Why did you go to India? What happened?
It came at a time where I had let go of my business and was in a sort of an intentional sabbatical of, okay, what is my work? What am I here to do? And I was approaching that really by slowing down. I was doing a lot of meditating and a lot of trying to just open myself rather than think my way through what that next step was. I was trying to sort of allow for something to emerge. And in the midst of a meditation one day, I had a very, very strong, fully embodied kind of vision of arriving at an airport in India and stepping out the front of the door of the airport and sitting down on the ground and just kind of waiting for what was next. And I dismissed it in the middle of the meditation as I'm just fantasizing at the moment, I'm just hallucinating. And it just kept coming. It was persistent, it was there. It was like, as I said, like a whole-bodied experience of this thing. So at the end of it, I got up and my wife was just in the next room, and I went to her and I went to speak, and I was just overcome with all this emotion and I couldn't speak for about a minute, and I was there's something I need to talk with you about. So she's waiting for me to say something. I eventually was able to say, I think I need to go to India for 6 months. And she just looked at me and kind of went, okay, and then great. And so, that was an amazing and wonderful kind of her receiving, this thing that I've just literally blurted out. So this was, I think, on a Saturday morning. And that afternoon, we were seeing two very dear friends. We were travelling down to Wollongong. So anyway, for at least an hour or so, I shared what had happened. And then they were like, well, what does this mean? And, well, are you going to go? And I was like, I don't know. It just felt so strong and so powerful and whatever. Anyway, by the next Tuesday, I just let the whole thing go as a bunch of nonsense and just self-indulgent, and how could I possibly leave my family and go and do that? And then somehow I was reminded of the hero's journey of, you receive the calling and then there's a denial of the call and then finally an acceptance of the call. And I spoke to my friend who I'd seen on the Saturday, and he was like, well, no, that was real. Like, you can't deny what you felt, like, pay attention.
And it will probably just keep coming back up otherwise.
Yeah, right. So anyway, by the Wednesday, I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. And then I was booked on the following Saturday to go, and I left in 5 weeks' time, and I booked for 6 months, and I literally arrived in the New Delhi airport with no plan. I just sort of thought, okay, the idea of just arriving, sitting out the front of the airport and waiting was basically what I did.
So literally what you saw in your vision.
Yeah.
And I know you eventually ended up somewhere in the mountains, in the nature, and you were working with some spiritual masters there as well. So tell me about that experience.
So I was on the plane approaching New Delhi airport, and you fill in the visa arrival, the immigration arrival form and like purpose of the visit. And it was, holiday, business. And then there's a box that says pilgrimage. And I thought, oh yeah, okay, I'll tick that one. And then only a few days after I was there, I sort of had cause to realise, because somebody was trying to pitch me this fancy, tour thing and pay all this money and go and see all these sites. And I thought, I've got no interest in that at all. And I said to him, no, that's not what I'm here for. I'm here as a spiritual seeker. It came out of my mouth, oh, okay, that's what I'm here for. So then I realised, right, so I'm just open to exploring my spiritual path. And I just really followed my nose. I allowed things to show up. And as it turned out, what happened was that I had episodes that lasted about a month of investigating and delving into a different spiritual lineage for about a month. And it was 5 of those, roughly, in sequence, from the teaching of Krishnamurti, who's an Indian philosopher, and kind of dropping his teaching into my meditation, to being at a Buddhist monastery up in Ladakh, which is up near Tibet, to, some learning from one of the Vedic teachers, Vivekananda, and his teacher, Rami Krishna, to arriving at a Zen meditation centre down in Tamil Nadu, and that, all of these just sort of literally things synchronistically popping up, and then ending up at another ashram, Sri Ramana Maharshi's ashram, who just had another beautiful kind of philosophy and teaching, no longer alive. So yeah, these were all kinds of phases, and it was kind of like just being at this amazing smorgasbord where you just had all this array of options in front of you, and I was just getting to choose and try it on and drop it into meditation and so on.
Amazing. I want to go too. So it sounds like you were able to combine all your passions. So pretty much your passion of being in nature, meditating, your spiritual journey, kind of combining them all and really spending 6 months just on your own to work through things and to, figure out where you want to go next in your life.
Yeah, I was very clear I wasn't going to maintain communication with anyone at home, except I had a phone call with my wife and kids about once every 3 weeks. I did no social media. I didn't communicate with anyone else because I really wanted to sort of, in a way, disidentify with who I knew myself to be and just, unlearn and step into a real neutral zone. So that was one of the things that I did to support that. And yes, being in nature. So I ended up having just 5 days out of that 6 months in busy cities. So the rest of the time was in the countryside, in small places, and again, access to lots of wild places and mountains and beautiful scenery and so on. So yeah, I think that really was a nourishing part of what I was doing as well.
So how did that change you as a person, and how did that change your life as a result of that?
I had been someone who was quite a kind of goal-focused, driven person in the earlier part of my life, and I went in my early 50s, and with a strong will and a strong determination. And I think of the will that I would have through that part of my life as a closed-fisted will, like I'm going to make this happen. And what I think I learned and was practicing over there was an open-handed will, which is that I'm still here. I've still got agency to make things happen in my life, but how can I receive and be open to the divine will, to the universal will? What am I being called to do? And not just from a large, what's my next career move, but even moment to moment existence. How do I exist in a way that allows for more of me being in flow with like a universal current or an underlying pattern or something like that? And that's what I was really practicing for that 6 months. And so there was a sort of an active surrender in that, a yielding. And that practice continued after I came home, because I think it was a great practice field to be in a new environment. But when I came home, now I was back into my very familiar surroundings with the people I know and so on. But I maintained that practice. And for almost another 12 months, I was still very unclear of what was I actually being called to do. But ultimately, what I've ended up with, I think, is a different kind of underlying program, if you like I de-installed that software of how I would operate in the world and installed a new one. And it's a different way of coming into action and knowing what to do next, which is more of a sensing and an embodied knowing and a trust and this sense of, I'm in a relationship with the universe. It's hard to describe. Words are very inadequate to articulate. So I don't know if that's making some sense, what I've just said.
Definitely, it sounds like a very profound experience that you were having there, obviously over a couple of months. And I love how you're talking about the state of flow and just kind of going with what comes to you and trusting the universe or whatever you believe in, that, the right thing will emerge for you rather than trying to think yourself into something, and also how you're describing that it's the being over the doing, I think as humans, a lot of the time we forget to just be. We constantly want to do, but sometimes that's very counterproductive to what we actually need to get done, you know? So, I really loved that experience.
I was very fortunate because I was so graciously supported by my wife. My kids had finished high school as well, so I think I'd reached a point in my life where I was somewhat more freed from some obligations, and I feel really grateful that I had the opportunity to do it. I guess, people do variations of all kinds of similar kinds of things where they'll unplug in some way from a life or a work situation or something that they've been in and step into a kind of like a not knowing, into an uncertain space. And I think it can be done in so many ways, but I think that's part of the practice of our life journey, is if we can allow ourselves the opportunity to step into, when it feels right, there's no need to force these things, but when it feels right, to step into a space of not knowing, of uncertainty, and just seeing what is going to arise next, And I think, I see and hear many stories of people doing that in their own ways.
I love that you had the opportunity to go to India and to do that on your 6-month pilgrimage. And I love that you were able to bring that back from India and actually keep going in your normal life, so to speak. But what would you tell people? How can they connect into that space, and how can they connect to nature, to themselves, to that spiritual place when they are just in their day-to-day lives? What would be your advice to people on how to get started on that journey, even if they haven't explored that before?
I think one of the aspects of nature we've sort of looped around in that last bit, but we haven't actually named, is this idea that there's outer nature and there's inner nature. And our outer nature is all of that, the trees and the animals and the wild nature and the earth around us. And then we've got this inner nature or human nature. And one of the reasons that I'd set on the course of letting my business go and stepping into the unknown was that I'd become really enamored with this practice of nourishing our relationship with outer nature. But I was like, well, hang on a minute. I don't think I'm really attuned and really highly aware of our inner nature and our human nature. What is this thing, our human nature? Why do we call it even human nature? So I became really fascinated by that. And I guess the answer to your question to me is that we all have our human nature and our inner nature. And what a rich and vast and unexplored ecosystem that is in itself. Our ways of thinking, our ways of feeling, our deep programming that we've received from our upbringing, our wounds that we've received from the traumas and the things that haven't gone so well for us, our natural inclinations and personality types. And you mentioned right at the start, and I forget the name of that 9-digit... 9
Star key.
North Star key again. These are all ways of sort of pointing us back into ourselves to see, who are you? What's going on there? And I think, the tip that I'm talking to and referring to is really recognizing that our own inner nature, our human nature, is another dimension of our relationship with nature that is as important to explore. And I suppose most of the listeners of your podcast are going to be on that sort of journey already. That's why they're listening to something like this. But, to recognize that it is another dimension of nature, because the way I think about this incredible earth that we're on is that we have arisen from it. We are part of earth. We're not separate. So, it makes sense that we refer to this thing of human nature because we are inextricably linked to the wider patterns of life and of earth. And so I think in the same way that we can nourish and remember, this rejoining and embody our relationship with outer nature, we can also work on those practices ourselves. And I think some of those things we've talked about of slowing down, relaxing, opening our senses, whilst it opens us to inner nature, it also allows us to get greater window and capacity for contemplation and reflection and awareness within ourselves as well.
David, thank you so much for this conversation. I could honestly keep talking to you for hours right now. This is so interesting enough. We've touched on so many different points where we could dive even deeper. You've got such an array of projects and work that you're doing. I feel like we could do another 4 podcast episodes just with you. We might do one later down the track, who knows. But thank you so much for being here, for taking the time to speak to me. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for your beautiful listening and the work you're doing to bring people's stories into the world. I've felt really valued and validated in the conversation, so thank you.
Thank you. We have mentioned a few books and resources while we were chatting today, so I will put those links into the podcast notes. I will also add links to, David, your work and your contact details for people, if they want to get in contact with you or if they want to learn more about you and your work. I will put that all into the podcast notes at the end. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. I really hope you got something out of this episode. It was such an open and honest conversation about nature, how it can support us, how we can connect into it, not just, when we're in the middle of the bush, but also when we're standing somewhere in the middle of the city, which is, I think, a really important point to take away today from this conversation. Please share this podcast with your family, with your friends, or anybody that you think might be benefiting from this information. I'm sending lots of love and light your way, and until next time.